This playlist collects and organizes the components of the lecture on Hill's paper on preserving the environment. So we'll start off talking a little bit about Dr. Hill. Then we'll turn our attention to the problem that Hill identifies, this idea that somehow even someone who's sort of scrupulously respectful of the rights of animals and people, who carefully calculates the cost and benefit before engaging in any action regarding the environment and so on, but nevertheless seems to have no other connection to it and is happy to destroy it whenever his calculations or her calculations indicate that the benefits are greater than the costs. Hill says, we find situations like this troublesome, and that somehow someone who has no connection or value for the environment other than as a resource seems morally troublesome to us. So he contemplates whether or not there are some things that we could say or explanations that we could give for why we find cases like this morally troubling. And he rejects three as not providing us with an adequate answer. So he starts by looking at whether or not we could, say, expand rights to non-sentient environmental elements like plants and forests and things like that. Then he looks at whether or not we could find the difficulty in our religious beliefs, that the person's violating dictates of religious doctrine, for example. Finally, he looks at whether or not we could find fault with the person because they fail to recognize the intrinsic value of, say, a pristine forest. After rejecting those suggestions, he goes on to formulate a different way of thinking about the problem in terms of what an indifference to the environment might be suggestive of in terms of the sorts of character traits that we would value and want to encourage in people. And so we'll finish the lecture by looking at his suggestion, his positive suggestion, and how he understands it. This is Thomas Hill. He was born in Georgia in 1937. He received his BA from Harvard in 1959. He completed a B.Phil in philosophy at Oxford University in 1961. And he did this during his tenure as a Rhodes Scholar. He received his PhD from Harvard in 1966. His current position is the Kennan Distinguished Professor Emeritus at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Now, he's written extensively in ethics and the history of ethics and in political philosophy. Some of his books include Virtue, Rules, and Justice, Kantian Aspirations, which was published in 2012, and A Blackwell Guide to Kant's Ethics, published in 2009. So what exactly is the problem that he wants to focus on in his paper? Well, as he formulates the problem is this. He says, suppose, in particular, we sense that part of the problem is that the natural environment is being viewed exclusively as a natural resource. What could be the ground of such a feeling? That is, what is there in our system of normative principles and values that could account for our remaining moral dissatisfaction? So, for Hill, he wants to understand why it would be that we would find the actions of someone who had this indifference, even if it was a sort of scrupulous and dutiful adherence to treating nature as a resource, but had no other seeming regard for nature at all, and would do things like, cut down old redwood forests or strip mine a hill or just pave over their yard so that they didn't have to maintain it. He says we find these sorts of attitudes towards the environment disturbing, and we want to know if there's any basis for our feelings of moral dissatisfaction and explain them and hopefully come to understand their significance. So he goes through the couple of possible solutions in the paper, thinks about ways that we might address this. And he starts off by looking at ways that we might argue that with the person who has these attitudes, that they are in fact doing something that's morally bothersome or bad, incorrect. And so he starts off by saying, look, we might try to argue for expanding the umbrella of rights to non-sentient living creatures like plants, and argue that the pristine redwood forest, in fact, should be considered to have rights. But he says the road to trying to do this, the arguments for trying to extend rights to non-sentient creatures, it seems controversial and difficult. He considers another possibility. Suppose we appeal to religious or other kinds of ideological doctrines. So respect for nature is part of your respect or your duty to God, for example. He says the problem with these sorts of arguments is that these doctrines aren't uniformly held by everyone. And so they're not likely to move anybody who doesn't already hold on to that particular ideology. And hence, they weren't going to provide us with a sort of blanket understanding for these things. And the last solution that he considers is this idea that, hey, maybe non-sentient life, nature in its pristine form, is just intrinsically valuable. That the wanton destruction of nature, even if it's in accordance with rights and even if it's for a benefit that is calculated to be greater than the cost, fails to take into account that nature in its pristine form is intrinsically valuable. That a field of flowers is intrinsically more valuable than a asphalt pavement when the person just paves over that area for no other reason than to avoid maintaining. So he says the problem with this sort of view, it's sort of intuitively attractive to some people, but how do we go about convincing anyone who doesn't already have those intuitions or those feelings or those values? Okay? So how would we go about giving reasons as to why or how we could know that nature has an intrinsic value? How could we justify it to people who don't see that in their own valuations? Short of offering reasons and evidence, he says, some people probably disagree. And the people who are most likely to disagree about the intrinsically valuable nature of the pristine environment are probably exactly the sort of people who would destroy the natural environment or see its value only in cost-benefit terms. So this kind of argument is really unlikely to be proven convincing to the exact people that have brought up the dilemma to begin with.